Welcome to the Workology podcast, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, gain powerful insights, resources, and perspectives on the industries of human resources and recruiting. Join your host, Jessica Miller-Merrill, chief blogger of bloggingforjobs.com, for a 45-minute in-depth and no-holds-barred look into the future of our most powerful business asset, the employee. And now, here's your host, Jessica, with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology podcast. It's great to have you on our new podcast as part of the Blogging for Jobs and Recruiters Lounge blog family. My name is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and I'm your host. Today, we are talking about small business HR. Small businesses have generated over 65% of the net of new jobs since 1995. These small businesses are also key to a successful American and global economy. There's also a place where a lot of bad HR happens, typically in small business. And this is what we're here to talk about today. So today I'm here with Stephanie Hammerwold. She is an HR consultant who specializes in small business spaces as well as also in California. So I wanted to just welcome Stephanie and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I kind of had a funny path into HR because I never had the ambition to work in the HR field. I had gotten my BA in English, and then I had gotten a master's degree in women's studies, and never had the ambition to work in HR when I was in school. But I'd been working in the nonprofit realm and domestic violence shelters as a victim advocate. Moved up to Santa Cruz with the hopes of kind of continuing that work, and then ended up going to a temp agency. And got sent out on an HR assistant job, thinking I would only stay there for a little while I found something more in line with what I wanted to do. But 7 years later, I was still at that same company as the HR manager at the distribution center. And so, really found my niche in HR. Ended up moving on from that job to work in the grocery industry at a small grocery chain up in Santa Cruz, doing recruiting, training, employee relations, leave administration. And after several years there, decided I was ready to kind of transition out of the corporate HR environment, and had a business partner that was ready to start a business. So I moved back to where I'm from, the LA area, and we started our consulting business about a year ago, taking all of our, HR experience and transitioning that into helping small business owners, kind of demystifying HR and providing support for places that didn't have a full-time HR person.
I always find it funny or interesting and how people ended up in the path to human resources. I'm also the same way in that I did not ever think in my wildest dreams I would end up in HR. But, I think it's a great fit for you. And also you do a lot of writing, and particularly in the HR space. So I think it's a nice way to kind of get maybe the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I agree. That's what I hadn't been a blogger before I started writing for Blogging for Jobs about a year and a half or so ago. And it was kind of a nice fit because I found I could combine all that HR knowledge with my love of writing. One of the most enjoyable parts of my week is when I sit down to write my blog post, just because I feel like I'm in my space whenever I'm sitting at a computer writing. And I think the only person I know that's ever kind of had that ambition to work in HR was my former boss, Sabra Reyes, who was a blogger for the site. She's written some stuff for Blogging for Jobs. And she was the only person I've ever met in HR who said, oh yeah, from early on, I knew I wanted to work in HR. That had that kind of, when I grow up, I want to be an HR director.
So kind of a funny story about how I have connected with Stephanie is that a friend of mine who is a former guest on the podcast, Marilyn Delborg-Delphus, actually introduced me to Sabra's family at South by Southwest. We sat next to each other and kind of hit it off. And then Sabra's dad says to me, oh, you're in HR, so is my daughter. And so then I connected with her and then ultimately connected with Stephanie. So it's kind of like the 7 degrees of separation in HR. I mean, probably less than that, but it's been great like having you on to share all this good information and resources, specifically in 2 areas that I think are really important and also very tricky: small business and then California, which is a whole podcast series in its own for certain.
Yeah, I went to a training not too long ago where an attorney mentioned, the great nation of California, because we almost have our own separate set of laws when it comes to employment.
I agree. But we're going to talk about mostly small business and over the next 40 minutes or so. And so I want to talk about how important, let's hope that we're having some maybe technology companies or small business CEOs or entrepreneurs who are out there and they're like, what is this HR thing? How important is HR in small business? How does it help add value to an organization?
I get this question a lot, especially when I'm out meeting people and they say, well, I only have a few employees. Do I really need to be thinking about HR? And my answer is always yes. Even if you just have a few employees, you're still bound by a lot of the same laws, whether that's paying overtime or meal breaks or, keeping a workplace free of harassment. It doesn't matter whether or not you have 5 employees or you have 500 employees. You're still bound by those same laws. I think a lot of small businesses are at a bigger risk because they don't have a dedicated HR person on staff. And especially if you're in a state like California that has the extra regulations, it can be a real challenge to kind of deciphering all those laws that are coming out there. I'm starting to read some of the things coming up for 2015. And, I think that's where HR comes in. And when you have a full HR department supporting your operations, you can kind of rest comfortably knowing that you have people looking out for that. When you're just 15 employees and an office manager who's covering payroll and accounts payable, accounts receivable, HR, all those things, it's very hard for that one person to keep up on that. And I think a lot of small businesses that make HR mistakes, it's not intentional. It's just that they don't understand the requirements or they don't know the requirements. So you don't necessarily need to have a full-time HR person for 15 employees, but it's good to be connected with an HR consultant or somebody who you can call to ask those questions when they come up. Because, as you know, there's always weird questions that come up when you're managing employees. It's never a straightforward yes, no answer.
No, there's always like the weird, wacky thing that only happens once in a lifetime. And it's good to have somebody that you can pick up the phone or have a cup of coffee with that is in your corner that can help be your advocate.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and I know, even after 10 plus years in HR, I have my friends in the field who sometimes I hit, a brick wall and can't figure something out, and I'll get on the phone and call them. And likewise, especially like if we're talking about leave administration, I have one former coworker who has stayed in touch. We worked together years ago, but she'll regularly contact me and say, oh, just have this quick little leave question, and we'll kind of talk it out because she's a sole HR person at her company.
I think that's an important point. And I don't want to discount the office managers. Those folks do phenomenal. They wear many different hats. And that's what part of a small business is. You have the CEO who does everybody's doing many different things. So you have to be an expert in many different areas. But the challenge with human resources, it is so complex and it's so just tricky and wacky. You can't be fully prepared for everything. And even if you read lots of books and get your certification, it doesn't mean that you're qualified to handle like these really specific, minute things.
Yeah, I agree. And I've met some office managers that I'm amazed at how many things they're able to kind of keep control of, given how many hats they're wearing. But yeah, I like to be that support for those folks to help train them on all the HR stuff to kind of give them that peace of mind.
So I'm going to go a little bit off course for a minute. And since we're talking about the office managers and kind of the front line for HR for the small business, where do you recommend that they go for good resources and information aside from, picking up the phone and working with you, which is the obvious first suggestion or recommendation?
There's a lot of good resources out there. There are a lot of free and low-cost webinars. A lot of attorneys put on like hour-long webinars for free, basically to help advertise for their services. But you can get a lot of good information that way. And generally, if you're getting that information from an attorney, it's pretty reliable. There are a lot of California-based attorneys doing very California-specific things as well. And I know some of the other states like New York that can be a little particular as well. They'll have things just focus on employment law in those areas. So I think webinars are an excellent resource, especially because you can just sit at your desk and attend without having to worry about all the time lost from driving somewhere. And generally, a lot of places send you the materials afterwards too, so you can start building your resource library. I think there's a lot of good stuff happening, like on Blogging for Jobs and other HR sites that you can read about. Just make sure that what you're reading, a lot of those things are kind of geared towards a national audience, so they're not state specific. So sometimes you have to drill down a little bit and find out what additional requirements exist in your state. But those are kind of our two of the biggest resources. And then just going out and meeting people, meeting other small business owners. Sometimes you'll meet a place that has 50 employees and they have an HR person you connect with. And, I've found a lot of really generous HR people that'll just be there, not necessarily to tell you exactly what to do, but just to bounce ideas off of. But yeah, those are kind of the three biggest areas I think for resources out there.
Agreed. I'll mention just quickly, and Stephanie and I are kind of in partnership and doing some learning webinars with a good website called humanresources.today, and they have some new cool stuff upcoming, and it's attorney led, and I think you're also participating and leading some webinars, Stephanie.
Yeah.
Resources for practitioners to be able to check out and kind of fill their brain with that knowledge they need to be able to do their jobs better.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing a performance management one soon, and hope to do more with them.
Yeah. Check out the website and just take a look, or hit Stephanie and I up with questions. I mentioned earlier in the podcast that small businesses, which I consider is less than 500 employees, account for 65% of the new jobs that are being created in our economy. Approximately 543,000. That's 543,000 new businesses get started each month. But more employer businesses are shutting down than starting up each month. And 7 out of 10 businesses are failing to make it past the 2-year mark. So there's a lot of new businesses entering and exiting the market space really quickly. When do you think is the right time for small businesses to add HR to their organization?
It's going to vary depending on where you see your business going. If you have 3 employees and you only ever plan to stay at 3 employees, then maybe having somebody you can call to ask questions occasionally would be enough. But if you're planning to grow, you need to be thinking about those HR operations from day one. If you're sitting there going, okay, I only have 2 people working for me right now, but in 2 years I want to have 50. You need to be thinking from day one about, I need an employee handbook. I need to set up my employee files. And, you can start by bringing an HR consultant on board to do that. I kind of think the magic number to have a dedicated full-time HR person is around 50 sooner if you're experiencing rapid growth. There are a lot of laws that change at 50 employees, like FMLA kicks in and you have to do leave administration. And a lot of employers aren't prepared to do that level of HR because just managing the FMLA, or if you're in a state like California with additional leave laws, is a huge task. So I've seen one of my friends got hired as a sole HR person at a company that was at about 35. They had planned to grow over the next 2 years to probably get up to at least 75 people. And that's why they brought her on board at that time. It varies, like I said, depending on your growth, but definitely by 50, you should consider having, I think, a full-time HR person on board.
I agree. And there's so much more that goes into preparing for that moment when you kind of hit those magic numbers. And you mentioned the employee handbook. I mean, if you're working with an insurance broker, negotiating and navigating that whole process, dealing with the benefits is an animal of its own if you have a 401k or these different things. So you really need an expert to kind of come in and kind of help you hold your hand and build these pieces of the HR puzzle for your business.
Yeah, and I also find too, employees are going to be more apt to jump on board with your policies if you put those in place from day one. If you suddenly have had this free-form workplace and then introduce this employee handbook, I think it can be a little bit more jarring. But setting up those expectations right away is a really good foundation for managing your employees.
Great. One thing that I have found funny, spending time in the San Francisco Bay Area, in the land of California, if you will, is you have a lot of these startups and these technology companies who come in and they experience rapid growth, and then they sometimes, and I'm not saying these policies are crazy, but they're a little bit somewhat of an HR nightmare, and things like unlimited vacation. Mm-hmm. Can really be a pain in the behind. Do you have any opinions on those kind of benefits or perks that they're offering employees like that?
I've been reading a lot lately on unlimited vacation just because I see that it's becoming more of a trend. And, I'm a bit on the fence about it because one of the biggest criticisms I'm reading of it is employees are less likely to take the time off when it's unlimited, because I feel like they need to be in the workplace all the time. And there's that kind of guilt we feel about I should be working. I shouldn't be taking time off. I also talked to somebody recently that was trying to deal with administering a leave of absence in conjunction with their unlimited leave or unlimited vacation policy. Because the employee is basically saying, well, I want to take this many months off in addition to my leave. So well, do we have to do that? And I said, well, you can have this unlimited policy. It's not necessarily job protected when you're taking that time off, but it gets kind of tricky. So I don't think we've seen enough yet with the unlimited vacation, how it plays out. I'm not sure what some of the issues that are going to come up with that are. Like I said, on the surface, it seems nice. I almost would advocate more for having a generous vacation policy and encouraging employees actually to take that time off rather than something unlimited. But yeah, and I think it's that whole thing of you want to have flexible and nice open policies, but at what point does it become prohibitive to running your business?
I agree. And I am always a little bit scared when I think about a limited vacation policy, because how do you when is enough? And it really depends on how your policy is written, and then case law to support what's happening and precedent at your organization. The interesting thing with unlimited vacation is that typically, like as I was in the corporate world and I exited to go to a new place, I would have vacation saved up.
Yeah.
And then I would take a couple weeks off to, kind of reassess, knowing that I had a nice little vacation cushion paid out. Well, now that we've created unlimited vacation, there is no vacation cushion bank that you're building.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah, so it's kind of led to this new thing, and 42 Floors in San Francisco, they're a tech startup and company, has kind of led the way in this, but they have a new process called precation. So to combat the fact that we have unlimited vacation. So basically, when you come to Jason's company at 42 Floors as a new engineer or whoever, they are offering 2 weeks of paid time off before you start working at their organization.
Yeah, I just read about that. I think you had posted it, and it sounds really interesting to me. And it sounds like a nice way to start things off. You have this employee that shows up for their first day and it's like, yeah, I was just in Europe, or I was just sitting on a beach in Hawaii. And I think that's kind of a nice perk to give your employees right out of the gate.
Yeah, I would say, and I think that hopefully you would agree, that the thing about precation that's fabulous, but there's still pre-employment, and new hire activities that need to happen.
Yeah.
Within a first amount of time. Do you want to talk about those?
Yeah, and that's true. Like, what happens if somebody takes that vacation and decides they don't want to work for you? And they're technically an employee. And that's another thing that comes up a lot, I think, with small businesses is understanding what do you do when you hire someone, and what's a fair hiring process. A lot of people who don't do a lot of interviewing. So a small business, if you only have like 10 or 15 employees, if we're talking about a really, really small business, you might only hire 1 or 2 people a year. And you're not necessarily super experienced in interviewing. When I was in corporate HR, I was doing maybe, some days 1 or 2 interviews a day, even more than that a day. And I got to the point where I could kind of, phone it in and it was easy. But I see a lot of people kind of entering nervous. They'll just show up without preparing any questions or anything like that, without understanding what you can and can't ask. There's a lot of tricky stuff around what's appropriate to ask. A lot of people make that mistake in interviews of saying, oh, so tell me about your family, and suddenly you're getting all this protected information about whether or not the person's married and if they have children. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding around that, I think, in the small business realm. And then all the way up to the onboarding process, what paperwork needs to be filled out. There's a long list of forms that need to be filled out, whether it's on the federal level or the state level. That you have to make sure you fill out. California has special reporting for all new hires, a form that you have to send into the state within the first 2 weeks of somebody working for your company. So there's that stuff. And that's, again, where an HR consultant or having some kind of HR support can help. But a lot of people think, oh, I'll hire an attorney, but you don't necessarily want to hire an attorney for something that, kind of HR level.
Yeah, agree. It might be a waste of your resources for sure. I want to talk a little bit more about creative benefits for the small business. And small businesses are in direct competition for talent within larger organizations. Not everybody can be a Google, and I think that that's okay. But we still are fishing for great employees within the same talent pools as many of these larger enterprises that are extremely popular. And you recently wrote a blog post on creative benefits for small business on Blogging for Jobs. What are some ways companies can make it attractive for talent to join their company using maybe these free or low-cost benefits?
Thinking of benefits as more than just insurance. Obviously, insurance is important, and that's going to be a big cost to you. But there's a lot of things you can add on to your benefits package that don't cost a whole lot. Some things I've been creative with in my HR experience, is contacting local businesses for discounts. Often you can find a local gym will gladly offer, a membership discount to your employees. Sometimes it can be an exchange too, that you'll offer a discount to their employees and they'll offer one to yours. And those are things that you can add on to your benefits package. Even making a small scale wellness program. There's some very robust wellness programs out there that incorporate wearable technology and all kinds of great bells and whistles, but you can have very simple things of setting if employees set basic fitness goals and meet those, then they can be rewarded with something like a $10 gift card somewhere. Employees love that stuff. It may not seem big, but I see it as kind of the bigger picture of employee recognition. The last place I worked before I started my business, we had a rather extensive incentive program where people could earn little tokens, for good customer service, helping out with a special project. Sometimes we'd have quizzes in the employee newsletter and they could earn a token for that and cash those in. They can get gift cards. They could get, t-shirts with the company logo on them, or we had hoodies that were very popular, that kind of stuff. People were really invested in that kind of program. So I think building a mini wellness program, having some kind of incentive program, getting local discounts to places, those are all things that are really easy to add. And I think one of the most overlooked benefits is the employee discount. And I know one of the first episodes of this podcast, you're talking a lot about employer brand and getting employees invested in that. And it's great if you offer a product or service, but what if your employees don't shop there or don't purchase that product, they're not very good brand ambassadors for you. And if you can make that really affordable for them, it's a way of recognizing their work and to also get them invested in what you're doing.
Good points. I think you just have to be really forthright and plan about what your benefits are going to be, but it doesn't have to be this crazy, super expensive program that to be effective. Let's take a bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast powered by Blogging for Jobs. Today's topic is small business HR with my guest, Stephanie Hammerwold. One of the most popular articles on Blogging for Jobs in really the 7-year history of the blog is one about HR metrics. I've kind of refreshed it a couple different times. It's there, and I discuss common formulas and metrics to help measure the effectiveness of human resources. If you want to go take a look at it, you can just go over to the sidebar on the right-hand side of bloggingforjobs.com and just enter in the search box HR metrics. But I wanted to ask you, Stephanie, and that your business, and especially working with the small business market in the human resources capacity, what are the most important metrics and formulas for HR to be monitoring, and how do these help demonstrate the business value that HR brings to the organization?
Some of my favorite metrics to look at really have to do with the hiring and retention. And that would be like looking at turnover and then kind of drilling down a little bit on that turnover number, because the number itself tells you one thing, but I think looking at the reasons why people are leaving your business, especially if you experience a mass exodus, what's going on? We saw this several years back when the economy kind of went down the tubes, is that people weren't leaving their jobs as much. And then, over the years, as that things started to pick up a little bit, you started seeing more and more people leaving for better paying jobs. That's a very clear message that, maybe I need to reevaluate my compensation structure and see if I'm really paying people an equitable wage with the market. And so I really like to look at those numbers. I also like to look at retention numbers in terms of how long people are staying. How long are they staying in a single job? And looking at promotions, are people that are staying with the company a long time staying in the same job, or do they tend to move up the ranks? My interests in HR are a lot more in the kind of recruiting realm and the training realm. So I also like to look at the effectiveness of training. I always kind of, unofficially looked at when I did a harassment training, did I get an increase in calls about harassment issues? And often I did see that. And it was typically from managers calling and asking, I have this situation, I'm not sure if it's harassment. So I can kind of justify to the powers that be that, yes, this training is important because managers are much more involved in that conversation about harassment.
Learning and development is such a growing area. It's been a focus of the HR Technology Conference when I was at Las Vegas last month. So I think that anything training related is important, and especially with the small business. Just on a side note, I want to talk a little bit about setting up your HR department. For the moment, let's just say that you're the new HR consultant who's working with an organization. What's the first thing that you do when you're just starting to work with a company?
The first thing I want to know is if they have an employee handbook. And if they say yes, my next question is, great, have you read your handbook? Are you familiar with it? Because I find a lot of places will get kind of a cookie cutter handbook, and there's a lot of software there that can help you develop your handbook, but they're not familiar with it. So how are you implementing policies that you're not familiar with? So I want to find out what if they have a handbook and how they interact with that handbook. And kind of the second phase of that would be their employee files. Where are your employee files and how are they set up? Because those are the kind of two areas that set your paperwork side of your HR operation. And once I have a handle on what those things are, then I can kind of delve into this specific policies and just the managing people piece.
One of my favorite things to do when I would be assigned to a new facility, because like you, I also have retail HR experience, which was definitely an adventure. I learned a lot and very quickly. But when I had a new facility, maybe one that I was going to be housed out of, and no one knew who I was outside of maybe the general manager, is I would sit in the break room for just a couple days with a couple magazines and just listen to what was happening. And for me, it was one of the best ways to get like a temperature gauge on what was going on with the culture, who liked who was dating who was leaving, and maybe how they felt about the management team.
Yeah, and I did that a lot in my last job because I would go out and visit all of the company's grocery stores. And especially with the more remote locations that I didn't get out to as often, if I was for a 1-hour meeting, I would plan to spend at least a half day, if not a whole day there, would get bring my laptop, get set up in the break room. I would wander around the store a couple times, buy a snack, talk to employees, because I think having that visibility and getting that feel of what the culture is at the location is a huge part of kind of understanding HR.
Agreed. And I also think that there's this misconception. Like, I never liked going into the store or a location sometimes because I felt like I brought like this big dark rain cloud of gloom and doom, which meant that if Jessica was visiting the office or my workplace, that meant that somebody was going to get fired today.
Yeah, that's kind of the reputation we always have, even though we do so much more, I think, in HR.
Yeah, and so I think that HR in general, like there is so much more that we do. So getting the word out, maybe getting on the floor a little bit more and educating the masses is important. I want to talk to you a little bit about HR audits, because I know we're working on a small business HR guide that we're going to have published soon on Blogging for Jobs. Tell me a little bit about the HR audit and why that process is so important.
And I think even for seasoned HR people, getting somebody external to your operations to come in and audit your HR practices is a really good idea, because sometimes when you're in the middle of it, you miss the things, the holes and the gaps in what you're doing. But what's going to be part of that small business guide is a checklist where somebody can almost go through and audit themselves, and then they can contact an HR professional to come help them fill in the gaps. If there's something on that list, you're like, I don't know what this is, which is something I've done with clients. Is I've gone and met with them, handed them a simple questionnaire. And one of my clients, the first time I met with her, she's like, I don't even know what this means. I said, well, that's a good example of something that we need to do. But a good audit's going to look at your handbook and see if you have all the policies you need. It's going to look at how you have your files set up. Look at the paperwork for your new hire process. Look at things like, do you have warning templates that you use when you need to issue a warning, to make sure all those practices are in place. It's the same way that you might get an accounting audit of your finances. With people being one of the biggest assets in your business, why would you neglect to do that for your people, but think that it's a necessity for your finances? And I think it's just as important to make sure that your people practices are good, because those are going to be the things that are going to cut down your risk of having a disgruntled former employee slap you with a lawsuit.
It's good to kind of organize your house and get it in order, your HR house occasionally. Even things that I don't think about very often are like records retention. Like, when is it okay to send maybe those documents, or what's the time period that I have to keep terminated employees I-9 forms? These are things that we don't deal with every day, but there's a process or a kind of a plan that should be in place.
Yes, I agree.
What advice do you have for new HR teams or business owners to understand as they're like looking at HR? What advice would you give them?
Going back to what I just said, employees are your greatest asset. I know that kind of sounds cliche, but it's really having solid HR operations is a big part of taking care of your employees, ensuring that you have a fair workplace that's in compliance with state and federal requirements. And those are all things that are going to contribute to making, a good workplace. I think people do a disservice to their employees when they ignore things like meal break requirements or OSHA requirements. And it seems a lot of times writing policies, job descriptions, all that kind of stuff can be a little bit tedious and sometimes a little boring. But it's really going to lay that groundwork. So that's kind of my biggest advice always to small business owners is don't ignore that. If you have a pipe that bursts in your house or in your business, you're going to call a plumber right away. You're not just going to let it sit there, because that could end up being a very expensive problem. The same thing with an employee. You don't want to wait for that pipe to burst with an employee, because they can end up costing you even more than the damage from the water from a leaky pipe. And so with HR, why would you ignore that? Why would you ignore that piece of your business that could end up being a big problem, but can also be the thing that ends up making your business grow? So contact someone, get some help in there. And it can be a fairly inexpensive project too, just to get somebody to come in and look at your operations and tell you the key areas to fix. A good HR consultant is going to help train you to be able to manage those things and isn't going to keep you in this dependent relationship, but they're going to teach you here's the regulation. That's what I do when I answer questions is I say, here's what you can do. Let me send you the link to the regulation so you have it for your resources, so that you can get good operations set up.
I just want to ask you, as far as regulations or laws, can you just give us maybe two insights on some of the most common employment laws or regulations that you're encountering as an HR consultant and providing advice to these small businesses on?
One thing that's kind of a regulation has to do with employee file management. And this is a really easy fix. That's why I always put it at the top of my list. And regardless of what state you're in, there are certain requirements of how you store your files. I go into places and I say, show me your employee files. And they bring me out this stack of files that has everything. And the first thing you need to do is divide that up. So your main employee file with all your hiring paperwork, performance reviews, corrective action, kind of general employment paperwork. And then all your medical information, such as leave requests, benefits forms, all that needs to be in a separate file. And then having your investigation notes in a separate file. And then again, having your I-9s in a separate place. I like to keep, all the I-9s in a binder or in a folder for the entire company, so it's easily accessible, but those can't be in your regular file. So that's, I think, the number one thing that people tend to get wrong, but is super easy to fix. The other thing would be the required notices for that are both federal and for your state. And again, very easy fix because a lot of places sell the all-in-one poster. You just need to make sure you're getting the one for your state. That includes the requirements on the state level as well as the federal. Here in California, we have the Cal Chamber that provides all that stuff and makes it really easy. There are also a lot of other companies. And then all the required notices that you have to give at the time of hire. And again, a lot of that is very state specific, on top of, maybe certain FMLA notices. Like in California, we have a couple other pamphlets we have to give out at the time of hire. Again, very easy fix, but sometimes just spending an hour with an HR consultant who can say, no, you need to make sure you have these things in place, these required notices, and your files need to be in this shape can do wonders for taking care of all those small things that can turn into expensive mistakes.
And it could be just little things like maybe you have your all-in-one poster and you decided to hide it behind a bookshelf or something. Like those are things that can get you in a little bit of trouble. They're small things, but they are expensive small things.
Yeah. And I would say in California, one of our biggest things is meal breaks, making sure that people are taking meal breaks correctly because we have so many extra regulations on that. And I think some other states have their own little quirks and things, which, again, seems like a very simple thing. Tell your employees to take a meal break. But it's created a huge headache for businesses here in California to make sure they're doing it right and to make sure employees are following through on that policy.
No, the meal breaks and the break times are so important. One of my first, I think, HR issues or situations that I came into when I was first in HR, 14, 15 years ago, was somebody who was trying to save up all her break time to be able to take a half day off. And, they need to take their breaks, and in certain states like California, we need to really make sure that they do that. Mm-hmm. You can't save up your break time, friends.
Yeah. I haven't seen somebody save up their break time. I've seen people try and put it at the end of the day so they could leave a half hour early. But yeah, that's a new one.
She was kind of like, it was retail as well, and it's like, oh, I need to leave at 2:00 on Friday. And so I'm already at my 40 hours, but I'm just going to save up all my break time for the week so I can leave, an hour and a half early or something.
Yeah. It'd be nice if it could work that way, but in California, definite no.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, Stephanie, on the Workology podcast. Where can people go to find out more about you and what you do?
Well, one of the nice things about having a last name like mine is I'm pretty easy to find online. There aren't a lot of Hammerwolds out there, and chances are if you find another one, they're probably related to me. So you can just Google my name. Every Monday I post on Blogging for Jobs. I'm also on Twitter as HR Hammer, and you can find me on LinkedIn. My consulting business, we're at hammerwoldpershing.com as well. So lots of places, and would love to connect with anybody who's listening and any readers of the blog.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure to include Stephanie's Twitter. If you just go to bloggingforjobs.com and look for this podcast, it's just bloggingforjobs.com/podcast, and it'll get you to all the previous episodes. But we'll have all the resources that she mentioned and how you're able to connect with her on LinkedIn, Twitter, and other various social networks. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, hosted by me, Jessica Miller-Merrill, where we discuss the science and art of the workplace, HR, and recruitment. Until next time, you can just visit bloggingforjobs.com to listen to all our episodes of the Workology podcast. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you next time.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by Total Picture.